Over the past year, the United States' approach to policing corruption has undergone a series of striking shifts, from the temporary pause of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act enforcement to the rollback of sanctions on very high-profile figures previously designated for corruption or corrupt practices, to staffing drawdown across the agencies that have really done this work. And at the same time, anti-corruption movements are really gaining momentum around the world. You see this from Nepal to Hungary to many others. And this raises real questions about what this moment means, both for US leadership and for the future of global enforcement. And whatever one thinks about United States capacity and legitimacy to police corruption abroad, the scale of domestic retrenchment is really hard to overstate. And I know this from our anti-corruption work, which our tracker has cataloged more than 100 changes to America's anti-corruption infrastructure in the past year alone. This is the Just Security Podcast. I'm your host, Dani Schulkin, and to help make sense of where we are and really how we got here, I'm joined today by two people who have spent their careers inside this architecture and building it. Richard Nephew is the inaugural U.S. coordinator on global anti-corruption at the State Department and now a senior research scholar at Columbia University. Bruce Swartz has spent 25 years at the Department of Justice as Deputy Assistant Attorney General and Counselor for International Affairs, where he oversaw extradition, mutual legal assistance, and the department's global rule of law programs, and has advised 9 attorney generals on international matters, and now the Barack Rule of Law Fellow at Yale Law School. So Richard, Bruce, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to turn to you now just to give the state of play. What's happening? Really walk us through this past year, the FCPA pause, the new June 2025 guidelines, the sanctions reversals, and the staffing drawdowns at DOJ and the State Department. Richard, I'll turn to you first.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much, Dani. Thanks for having me. And always good to see you and Bruce again. Maybe I'll just stick to the State Department and USAID side of things, some of the foreign policy aspects of the anti-corruption fight. Or frankly, I think this story is pretty bleak. Over the course of the last, we're 17 months in or something like that, we've seen a pretty dramatic reduction of the scope of U.S. ability to support anti-corruption efforts abroad. I think the biggest thing that we all know is the destruction of USAID and the elimination of a lot of the programs that it was engaged in around the world for anti-corruption best practices and for improvement of national systems. And look, we could have a good long debate over whether or not all those programs were great, whether or not there were things that ought to be done to improve them. But the reality is they were doing a lot of good work, and a lot of that is now gone by the wayside. Within the State Department, we've had pretty dramatic changes in terms of the anti-corruption setup. My old office is no longer in existence, and the folks who staffed it have now gone to other parts of the department. It's still working on anti-corruption efforts, but some of the tools appear to have been, if not eliminated, at least reduced in scope. And you already put your finger on one of them, which is sanctions. I was, in fact, just reading this morning a piece that Just Security put out, good timing, that noted that there haven't been any corruption-related sanctions designations over the course of the last 17 months, but there sure have been a lot of reversals. A number of people have been removed from the list with, frankly, very little explanation as to why or justification. And, I'm sure we'll get into it, but look, if you're going to remove sanctions on somebody for corruption, you kind of have an obligation to explain why and whether or not this is a good thing, what the justification is for it. Without that, you're left with some pretty interesting questions. So overall, I would say the foreign policy aspects, we still have people working on anti-corruption. We have things like reports that are due to Congress that are coming out and representation at the Conference of States Parties for the UN Convention Against Corruption. There are lots of good people still doing good work. But I think what you see is that some of the tools have been put in the bag and that there's an overall diminution in a lot of the anti-corruption work that was being done.
So, Bruce, can you walk us through what's happening at DOJ and enforcement on these matters generally?
Sure, and I don't want Richard to be more bleak than I am, so I will certainly say that the situation in the Department of Justice is, if anything, more disturbing, although not unrelated, since we relied entirely on State Department for the funding for our overseas anti-corruption capacity building work. But on the operational side, as Dani, you've already suggested from the outset, we've seen a remarkable change across the board in how FCPA is thought of and how it's actually being pursued. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, as you know, is a landmark piece of legislation in 1977. It's had bipartisan consensus. As recently as 2023, it was expanded to the Foreign Extortion Prevention Act to capture the demand side. But it's an act that President Trump has always publicly stated that he, shall we say, strongly disagreed with. He thought it interfered with American business overseas. He's been quoted as saying that he wanted to free up American companies to do what he felt every other company from every other country was doing, which was to bribe foreign officials. And again, as you mentioned, there were a series of 3 acts early on, very early on, in the first months of the second Trump administration that really brought this home. First, the Attorney General, on her first day, Attorney General Bondi, indicated that the FCPA unit should refocus its priorities on cartels and transnational criminal organizations, a rather curious reprioritization since we already had a number of statutes that dealt with that issue, and the FCPA is not particularly well situated to deal with that. Second, of course, about a week later in February, the president issued an executive order pausing for at least 6 months, unless the attorney general specifically authorized otherwise, all FCPA cases for further analysis. And then in June, after that analysis was conducted, and after approximately, by public reporting, half of the pending FCPA matters were dismissed, new guidelines were issued by the Department of Justice about FCPA prosecutions, making clear that the goal was to pursue, I think we can say, an America First policy. The prosecutions were not, and investigations were not to focus on the actual full range of activities so much as activities that might disadvantage American businesses. And again, the cartels were mentioned. But as a matter of national security, certainly the suggestion was that the priority should be going after foreign companies engaged in corruption that might interfere with the United States. And implicitly, it could be read as suggesting that national security-related corrupt activities, rare earth minerals, other matters, might not receive the same attention. As long as we're mentioning just security articles, and I know we're supposed to all flog our articles in this regard, we did write an article about this in Just Security. Richard's done a very good piece looking at it 1 year on and the effects of this in Just Security. And of course, Dani, you've done enormously important work across the board, including some of the proposed legislative changes that would weaken this. So that's the structural matter. Glad to go into the staffing, which, as Richard points out, is also critical. You can keep, even if you keep statutes in place, if you don't have the people to enforce it. And across the board at DOJ, we've seen a diminished number of people now that are assigned to deal with these matters.
So the picture is bleak.
Yeah, mine's bleaker. Mine's bleaker. I just want to be clear.
Right. There's a competition.
Right. Yeah.
But kind of taking a step back, what's the view of this bleak picture from abroad? You know, with the United States is stepping back, the politics of corruption we've seen explode in other countries. Take Nepal, as I mentioned, with the Gen Z protests over the Nepo baby trend, and then the social media ban that really toppled the government there. Just recently, we had Hungarian voters throw out Orban after 16 years, with the opposing party almost explicitly running on corruption claims, corruption charges, the EU funds that were frozen over rule of law concerns. And this follows Sri Lanka, Bangladesh. So what does this tell us, where you've got these publics mobilizing against corruption at exactly the moment that the United States is signaling that maybe it's not a priority for us, both internally and externally?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'll start off and say corruption ain't popular, right? I mean, it really isn't. And it's a motivator for a lot of political action around the world. You were listing all those good examples, but I think, if you were to go to, any public, whether we're talking about, European, American, you're talking about African countries, I mean, you're going to find a lot of people dissatisfied with the idea of corruption. Now, they may believe that it's baked in, right? They may have a sense that there isn't much we can do because the powerful elites are in a position to do X, Y, and Z. But this is actually where I think the damage from the U.S. retreat from the battlefield is so significant. Because in a lot of places that we were going, we were seen as people who could lend a hand. And that lending a hand could either be through the good work that was being done by DOJ and the FBI and the entire law enforcement universe, or it could be in terms of programs and assistance to develop cases, improve law enforcement activities around the world, to increase the use of beneficial ownership registers, to improve financial intelligence systems, all those things that we were contributing to, on top of which supporting and working with civil society organizations, to make sure that they felt supported and that they felt like they had the resources they needed to contribute. All of that retreat, I think, is being badly felt. But on top of that, you get to I think the worst element, which is now it's seen as we're playing for the other side. And look, there has always been, and there will always be, criticism of U.S. foreign policy, criticism of the idea that the United States is separate. I spent 2 years going around the world and encouraging people to rally around anti-corruption. Always got back you guys think you guys are so good. You've got lots of problems in the United States as well. And there are plenty of political cases that you could point to, both current and historical, to point to that. But one of the ways I think that we were in a position to at least say, yeah, we've got trouble here, but we're all working on it together, was to be able to point to instances in which there are cases like Bob Menendez having gold bars in his freezer, and say, but when those things happen, we're in a position to respond. So I think it's both the fact that we've retreated internationally and where we've got so many instances within the United States and at the highest levels where there are open questions as to why people are making the decisions they're making, whether or not they're doing it for their own benefit, and whether or not they're stacking the deal more in their favor, that I think has contributed not necessarily to not to malaise, not even to resignation, but to more kind of a fury that we have decided that we are no longer interested in these sorts of things. And I think there's a mixture of furious sadness, maybe the right way of putting it, that we're not on that correct side right now at this point. That is what I've been hearing. That's what I've been experiencing when I've talked to folks abroad.
Bruce, I know you're involved in a lot of conversations with international prosecutors and others. Is that what you're hearing, or is there something else?
No, I think Richard is absolutely right that there's sort of two countervailing currents here. I think it's very much the case that the administration across the board is seeking to normalize corruption, to say this is just the way the world works. That's partly the messaging about the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. But as Richard points out, it's also what we see in the paper every single day. So there's that. In fact, one of the arguments that seems to be out there is, well, if it really were corrupt or if it were improper, we wouldn't be so public about the things that we're doing, which is a somewhat perverse but clever way of arguing it. And I do think that polling that I've seen and analysis suggests that corruption is very high among American voters, just like people around the world. Although much of it here is seen through a partisan lens. This is, of course, what others did, so this administration is not doing anything that others didn't do. But if we look at what's happened structurally, as Richard points out, and Dani, as your work has demonstrated, the guardrails, not just in terms of statutory enforcement, if you will, but the ability to enforce these matters has been vastly diminished, whether it's through dismissal of inspectors general and the control that they would have in looking into waste, fraud, and abuse in the government, whether it's the elimination of the public integrity section, largely, from several dozen down to reportedly just a few people. This is the key Department of Justice office that looks at corruption investigations. And as Richard points out, it's oftentimes lost that until this sort of partisan approach taken, I think it's fair to say now, across all prior administrations, even Trump one, there were people prosecuted, high-level people from both parties at a time in which it would have, if you really just had a partisan approach, you would have never done. You wouldn't have done in the Mendez case, for instance, if you had a partisan approach to anti-corruption. So that's been very much taken apart. But you have to look beyond just the public integrity section or the Foreign Corrupt Practice Act section. You've also had the disbandment on day one of Attorney General Bondi of the Kleptocracy Initiative, which was really one of our most successful efforts to recover stolen funds from by other government officials in other countries that transited the United States. The elimination of the Foreign Influence Task Force by the FBI, and just the general undercutting of white-collar crime enforcement. And the Cato Institute has reported that at least one-fifth of FBI agents have been reassigned to do immigration matters, which is a big blow, of course, to the ability to do these kinds of things. But that's all on the negative law. On the positive side, as I think you've pointed out, Dan, I think there are two things. First, as Richard has said, people don't like corruption, so it does provide a basis for, one hopes, political change if it can be mobilized in the way it was Hungary or Nepal. The second is to see what other countries are doing to fill the enforcement gap and whether they're going to be willing to or have the ability to do this. In some ways, it's a little bit like the NATO problem or any of the alliance problems in which the United States is always such a dominant role. Other countries have not necessarily put the resources into it. But they have at least created the structural ability to do this. And that's very important from starting, and this is one of the points of our Just Security article, taking Professor Coe at Yale's theory of how transnational legal process works. We basically, to use his terminology, uploaded the FCPA norms into other international conventions. First OECD, now most importantly, the UN Anti-Corruption Convention, UNCAC, Convention Against Corruption. And that means that other countries have had to criminalize this to be part of those conventions. And increasingly, countries have said that they're going to put the resources to it. Most specifically, the alliance announced last year, shortly after we took down our FCPA enforcement, although the countries have been careful to say it wasn't in reaction, of Switzerland, France, and the UK. So that's an important step. EU has just put out a new anti-corruption directive just in the last month, which is also another significant step. And you've seen other countries begin to talk more about this and about what can be done. So at Yale, where I am now at Yale Law School, we have a new project against corruption and kleptocracy, partly to deal with what Richard has said, to try and make sure that there is a place where you can find the information about what's happening and to think about how you do come back from this.
So can you say a little bit more about these, the groups that exist, the groups that are forming? Can they actually fill this U.S. enforcement gap, if that's what we can call it? Will this work? What, are U.S. states involved? I want to just press on a little bit more about the gaps here. Maybe Richard, with you first.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'll say briefly. I mean, can they fill the gaps? Probably not, but can they add to where they were, and can they, maybe paper over those gaps and keep some things going, keep the trains running for a bit? That feels a little bit more likely. And taking half a step back, it was never the U.S. intention to be the only state that is doing all this work. Frankly, our objective all along was to rise the tide so that all boats would lift with it as well, and we would get more folks involved in these sorts of things. So, to a certain extent, it's a positive that if the U.S. is retreating from the battlefield, that other people are prepared to step in more, put more resources to it, and so forth. I think the problem that we keep coming back to is twofold. One, look, this was an effort that was under-resourced internationally already. We did not have the kinds of resources necessary to combat corruption that involved, very wealthy individuals and very wealthy interests being able to push back and combat, our efforts in turn. And so, there's a competition here that we were already behind on, and the U.S. not being as much in place is going to hurt. And I think the second thing is we shouldn't forget the systemic importance of the United States still to the global economy and to the global financial system. And I think that's a flaw and that's a problem with other countries stepping in at this point. They still need us because of jurisdictional issues associated with where money is potentially moving, where people are resourcing, and of course as a place where people want to travel and those sorts of things. So to my mind, I think it's all good work, and I see the positives there. I look forward to a time in which we can recontribute to it, and I think my hope is that while we may have shrunk a little bit, the networks that established are still there, so that way in a future environment we can potentially come back and then help those systems advance more. But definitely defer to Bruce and any thoughts you got on the system.
No, I think you're right, Richard. I mean, this work is highly resource intensive. It also draws on years of expertise. Oftentimes, people who are doing it for us, both the FBI agents and other investigative agents, and the prosecutors were people who really dedicated their careers to this work. And if anything, we now have additional complexities in the abilities to move monies, including through cryptocurrency and other aspects that are going to make this more difficult to investigate. But I do think it is a positive, as you say, that other countries are at least saying that they're going to step up and do this. We can think of this as this is all just a big test that we've done in the Trump administration, just a way to see if other countries will respond. Maybe that's the happy explanation. But I think that the fact that France and the UK and the Swiss did talk about doing this and trying to think about ways of doing it, while it's not a joint investigative team in the classic sense, is at least one way of trying to send a signal. I do think that the EU anti-corruption directive is interesting, both in terms of harmonization and in terms of the jurisdictional basis it requires member states to have to investigate corruption, which would capture, in the way that we capture corrupt activity through the use of the US financial system, would include transmission of information across EU networks, even if those are foreign IT networks, but happen to make use of that particular country. So it's a pretty expansive approach in that context. I think we'll have to see if it bears fruit. One thing that should give people pause here is that countries are encouraged to, not required to, under the UNCAC, under the UN Convention Against Corruption, to do exactly what the United States did, which is to criminalize the the demand of bribes by a foreign official. In other words, we can now prosecute foreign officials who ask US companies for bribes. That also means that foreign countries that have done the same can prosecute US officials who ask for bribes or engage in corrupt practices. Now, people will say, well, what country is going to dare to do that with a US official? One thing that should be borne in mind in that context is that other countries, in contrast, it turns out, to the United States, do have independent prosecutorial services that are not under strict political control. So it's not inconceivable that we would find this the case. In fact, I was at an international anti-corruption conference, and the opening speaker, a foreign prosecutor who was welcoming us to his country, said, it's so hard to speak to Americans now unless you're carrying gold bars or Rolex watches in your pockets. And I thought, well, that's an interesting picture of where we are as seen as a country, but also that countries are well aware that there may be issues being raised by their companies' dealings with US officials. And then finally, just turning back to Dani's point about the states. While it's not every state's going to be able to do this, Attorney General Rob Bonta of California made clear immediately after the Department of Justice was eviscerated in this regard in April that violations of the FCPA may also be violations of California's unfair competition law. And that is an important thing, particularly given the size of California's economy, the context companies have there. So that I think is an important step. New York has similar legislation. Oregon took on the Coinbase case, not a Foreign Corrupt Practice Act case, but saying, we'll have to fill the gaps. So I think that's another possible bulwark against the complete elimination of prosecutions in this regard.
So I want to play devil's advocate just for a second. So the administration has said that aggressive enforcement of the FCPA, for example, hurt American competitiveness. They've created a new corruption fraud unit, a fraud unit at the Department of Justice, saying that there's more important corruption priorities, for example, Medicare fraud in Minnesota. And I want your take on whether this holds up. Is this recalibration somewhere in the range of normal? Is this something different? What actually is the strongest version of the argument for what the administration is doing? Is there anything legitimate there? And kind of relatedly, where, if anything, did prior anti-corruption consensus get something wrong that actually needs correcting?
Well, Richard, I don't know if you want to start, but I can just say quickly on the new corruption task force or division or whatever it is, I would certainly feel more confident in that if it didn't seem to be directed in a partisan manner towards certain states. And then, of course, as anyone who knows the history of the department is aware, it's completely duplicative of work that was already being done by the fraud section. One of our largest and most successful parts of the fraud section was the Medicare, Medicaid fraud group. They've done enormously impressive work. They've used highly sophisticated technology to target those cases. So this is not anything new or anything necessary. It also is quite mistaken to suggest somehow that you can't do both, even if you really wanted to do this. And of course, we've always been doing both. And the resources devoted to this are so tiny by comparison to the return. I mean, we more than paid all of our fraud investigations more than pay for themselves. So it's not a resource matter. And finally, of course, it's all undercut by the fact that the president has been publicly saying that he is against FCPA. So it's not a recalibration or redirection. It's putting this in a place where it will not be a priority for enforcement, if at all, or can be used as a tool against particular disliked companies. But it's not about moving resources to fight corruption effectively elsewhere.
Yeah, and that's where I would jump in. I think any one of us who spent time in the system, working on these sorts of issues can, I'm sure, think of a project or two and say, nah, that was kind of a waste of time, right? Maybe that wasn't the thing that we should have spent our money and time on. But this is where I come back to the idea of reform as opposed to elimination, and whether or not these are actual reforms or whether or not they're elimination of function. One of the projects that I was doing the entire time I was coordinator was trying to work with our colleagues at USAID and throughout the State Department to identify how we're doing anti-corruption programming abroad. What are the categories that we're investing in? Are we spending more time on civil society support as opposed to law enforcement support? And what's the percentage? And which ones are more effective? Where can we actually demonstrate that we've been had successes in other places too? And that work was identifying, I think, areas in which we could have prioritized funding. We could have prioritized report, and we could have said, okay, we have found that actually when we invest in, creating business environments abroad that, have got reporting requirements and financial disclosure requirements, and those are followed up on, that's most effective as opposed to some other example, right? Those are the kinds of bits of analysis that we were doing because we could see that there was a need to recalibrate potentially where we were. But the approach that was taken instead was just to eliminate a whole bunch of functions, right? And to just say, forget the scalpel, we're going to come in with a hammer and we're going to treat all these things as equal. And the problem with that is it almost creates a self-fulfilling prophecy, because you say, well, the reason why is because these weren't effective because we weren't able to combat corruption. Corruption's endemic, and then lo and behold, corruption becomes endemic, and it becomes a lot harder to winkle out. So what I keep coming back to is, was there a critique you could offer about how we were prioritizing some of our anti-corruption resources, especially in international activities abroad? Sure. Sure, I no problem with saying that. Part of the reason why you have things like the Cardin Bill and the new report that we're now doing to identify successes in work abroad, as opposed to places where we still have deficiencies and things to work on, was to shape what we needed to do more of. But the problem is that now we just don't have those resources and concentration, and it lends itself exactly as Bruce was saying. I couldn't agree more that there is a different motivation behind this. And the last thing I'll say too, I also don't have a problem if you want to focus what resources you do have on particular salient issues for national security issues. But I do think it suggests, especially the emphasis in the FCPA, memo that came out, is a lack of understanding of the environment that's created by corruption, how it's a seedbed for all those problems that are identified there. And I think this speaks to a walk back of research and analysis that has taken literally decades to do, to think about what are the environments that are conducive to narcotics trafficking, to terrorism, to all of these sorts of ills we're trying to address, all of which have got potential solutions. But all that's now been thrown away instead for a spurious attempt to try and prioritize on things that as Bruce said, potentially had other systems already in place, other legislation in place, other sections that could be potentially addressed as well.
So looking ahead into the future for a second, and this will be my last question. If, let's say, a future administration wants to rebuild or reinvent, what is actually repairable, say in months, what takes years, what may already be permanently lost, and what's the one thing you wish people understood about what's at stake in this moment?
So, in terms of what could be rebuilt, I think we can distinguish, uh, if you will, between the operational side of things and perhaps the norm, or if you will, the standing we have internationally to speak of these things. That the point Richard made about how we're seen abroad when we go and talk about these issues. I think that the latter is going to be much harder to rebuild. It's going to be harder to make the argument that the United States is committed to these issues, even if there were to be a new administration of either party, and I worked for both parties, that made this a focus. People are going to say, well, that's great now, but what happens if it changes? Again, these were laws that were in the books. You're not even talking about norms. You're talking about actual criminal statutes that weren't enforced. So I think that's going to be a long-term process, and it'll probably have to be congruent with and accompanied by a larger process about what the United States stands for. Operationally, I think what it would take is making sure that you're bringing back or hiring to build in the expertise that you need to do these cases, particularly, as I said, in a more sophisticated financial environment than ever. That you would certainly want to rebuild the kleptocracy initiative, one of our most successful programs as an investigative and prosecutorial group. You'd want to build out the FCPA. You'd want to build out public integrity for the reasons Richard said, to show that we are committed to doing this in our country. And maybe that's partly how you build back up the United States standing, by showing we are doing this. We're not just talking about it. We're going to do it. And maybe that's the most effective manner. And I also think, as Richard said, we'll have to really think about what our overseas capacity building programs would look like. But I'll stop there.
Yeah, I very much agree with all that. And I would just sort of add maybe two elements to it. One, completely agree. This is not a partisan issue. UNCAC was brought in place under a Republican. The Corporate Transparency Act was brought in place under the Trump administration, and it was negotiated throughout all of that. These are not issues that have to be or should be partisan. Frankly, these are law enforcement issues. This is good economic development support. This is about American economic competitiveness and national security. These are issues that all sides have got ownership of. So I think, I would start with, trying to restore that nonpartisan balance that we used to have on these types of things to say, no, this is about a broader stand in the United States and our ability to deal with challenges. And I think that feeds the second piece, which is absolutely we have to do a lot of work at home. We won't be successful internationally if people still think that we have double standards, that we're not serious about these things. When you look at the efforts right now ongoing to eliminate the Corporate Transparency Act, you look at the efforts that were done to eviscerate the funding support that was being given to FinCEN and others so that it can actually operationalize these things. I mean, you have an intrinsic lack of seriousness that you then need to repair, and frankly, you need to go farther. And this is where the critique that I heard consistently abroad is, you guys are all about anti-corruption when it's things that don't benefit you. But when it's something that benefits, the city of New York, or when it's something that benefits, Delaware and its LLCs, somehow you guys come over all shy. And I think this is where, things like the Enablers Act, and to be able to demonstrate that we're going to take seriously, even when it has an effect on, some of our own economic sectors and interests, we're going to take these things seriously. That's going to be incredibly important to demonstrate to everyone else that we're prepared to clean up our own yard before we'll go talking about others. And then I think the third thing, and this goes to both the staffing issue as well as to the resourcing issue that'll happen for abroad, we have to get back to this prioritization of effort work that we were doing. We have to think critically about, we can't do everything. We can't do everything everywhere. We can't do everything all at once. What's our biggest bang for the buck? Where are there places where we can make the biggest bit of advances? And in some places, it may be different. In some places, it may be about supporting law enforcement. In other places, it's about supporting the business sector, or, working with, companies on things like the EITI, the extractive industries, initiative. So that way you're able to build in transparency steps. Those are the sorts of things, to my mind, that only can come through a real clear understanding of what has worked, where do we have resources now, and then to do that kind of prioritization exercise, which has to be done, with a spirit of openness. If there isn't actually any benefit that comes out of the tremendous devastation that's been done, is that we won't be starting with a blank slate, but we will be starting with at least the ability to say, okay, we have to rebuild. What do we rebuild first? And you don't start with the roof or the windows. You start with the foundation, and where can we build that most effectively?
So it sounds like a bleak status quo, but potential for future hope and
This
rebuilding and reinvention. Is
the
that
sun
right?
the sun is coming. It's coming up tomorrow, right?
Tomorrow.
Yeah.
And Danny,
We can see the rays.
you're young enough, Danny, to actually have a chance to see it. That's great. So,
Well, I want to thank you both for talking today. This episode was hosted by me, Dani Schulkin, and produced by Maya Neer with help from Pooja Shah. And very, very special thanks to our guests, Richard Nephew and Bruce Swartz. You can read all of Just Security's coverage on anti-corruption efforts on our website, including our anti-corruption tracker and follow-on series, which both Richard and Bruce have contributed to. So thank you so much.
thank you, Danny.
Thank you.